G'day. So once again, I thought I'd throw together a comprehensive guide and an asset review, but this time for the Better Fog system by iNab Studios. For the review, head to the video description and you'll find a timestamp there, and then you can jump back to here to continue the video. Everything will be linked in the video description below, along with links to the asset and to the developer's documentation. I prefer guides to be quick and concise. However, due to the nature of assets and Unity in general, it's hard to gauge just how much experience someone has when coming to an asset. After all, the purpose of assets is to speed up development time. And if you're buying an asset, it generally means that you don't know how to do it yourself, or you want to save time. And I'm somewhere in the middle. So all my guides will be geared towards new users of Unity, and I'll only be expanding on things that I need to know. That being said, there's a lot that you can change via code with this asset, so I'll be doing a big code section towards the end as well. Now, I just want to make a quick side point here. It's in my honest opinion that the Unity Store's asset ranking system has been tarnished. These days, if an asset doesn't get 5 stars, most people think it's not worth their time, and developers feel pressured to beg for 5 stars. I believe the 3-star rating should mean that the asset is functional and does the job. 3 stars should be the baseline. 4 stars should represent high quality but with minor limitations, maybe less support or few bugs. A 5-star rating should mean what it means. It's a flawless and well documented and an active support asset. 1 star means that it fails to deliver on its promise or is falsely advertised. And a 2-star would indicate serious issues like an asset claiming it supports HDRP but supporting it entirely. And 2 stars would indicate that there's a serious problem with the asset. Maybe the HDRP isn't working. One day I do hope to dive deeper into this, but for now I'm a nobody, but I just thought it was worth mentioning and moving on. So what does the asset actually do? I've said it before and I'll say it again, it's genuinely shocking how many assets actually fail to convey exactly what they do. But I think Better Fog is relatively clear about what it does. Simply, the asset creates a fog effect inside your scene. This effect can be customized rather easily. So if you want fog in certain areas, or whether you want to affect a whole scene and the Skybox, you can customize it to your needs. It's able to do this using the Unity volume system. If you're not familiar with volumes, they're a Unity component that can be attached to a game object like any other. They're used for things exactly like fog, contrast, gamma, brightness, and even color hues. The key thing to note as well is that they can affect the entire scene, but they can also simply be changed so they can affect only certain areas, or you can even have it where it just follows a player around, so that way it's not permanently being used in the scene, with the added bonus of being able to have more than one fog effect active at any time. So where could you possibly use this asset? Well, personally, I'm an RTS fan and I 100% see this asset being useful for a fog of war system. You can even use other cameras in the scenes, that way they don't see the fog at all, which might be useful for cases where fog of war is disabled or removed entirely for observers. Obviously in RPGs, the default fogs will do exactly as you need. You can even get the fog to appear that it's moving with this asset, and I'll dive into that in this guide. You could even create a game that uses an ability like Flash from Pokemon to reveal an area around you. So let's see the asset store page, and here it is here. As you can see, there's a video here that's showing us a quick showcase of these different fogs being used in this little village example. And if we scroll down, we can see that it supports built-in and URP. It's got some features here. It's got compatibility. It says that it supports versions 2021.3 and above. It supports Unity 6, but you have to see the limitations below. So there's some limitations here that you can see on the screen. We have only support directional light scattering, non-volumetric, no MSAA support, requires device capable of depth rendering, no support for orographic, camera, VR, WebGL, VFX, graph particles blending. The way that this is written, it looks like that's only for Unity 6. I'm not too sure. I can't confirm, but there is a link to the documentation here. If we go to releases, we can see that the current version is 2.0. However, it is worth noting that when you import the asset into your project, the asset is going to come up as version 1.3. Version 1.3, version 2, that's the current version. If we go to reviews, you can see that there's a few reviews here already. And scrolling down, we can see that there is one 1-star review. And this user says that it states that it supports Unity 6, but it does not work in the demo scene, and the support is bad. No reply for more than 2 weeks. Please be careful. I do have to admit that the support for iNab Studios is definitely on the slow side. They do get around to replying, but the documentation is quite strict. You do need to follow a very strict install process, and there is settings that you can't miss that will make it look like the asset's not working, which is why I'm hoping that this guide will be used for. So hopefully this user does see this guide, because this will get them to have the asset working with Unity 6 URP, which is exactly what we'll be using. Alright, so let's get into actually making the project now. I'm going to be making a Unity 6 project using URP. So let's go ahead and make that. So I'm going to go here and make a new project. I'm just going to make sure that I've got Core selected, and I'm going to go Universal 3D for URP. I'm going to go up to my Unity editor version at the top and select the latest release of the Unity 6 version. I'll have to go through and remove all those other versions, so that way I don't have them all cluttering up. I'm going to name my project, which I have here, Better Fog Tutorial. I'm going to scroll down, make sure that I've got Connect to Unity Cloud disabled, because this is just a guide. There is no use to having it connected to the cloud. Okay, with all of that set up, let's go ahead and create the project. Okay, now that we're in our project, the first thing I'm going to do is just remove this README asset. We don't need that. Proceed. Alright, now that we've set up the project and we've gone through and spoken about all the intro stuff, I'm just going to go ahead and disable my camera now. We don't need to see my face, and I don't want to risk having my camera in the way of important settings over here in my inspector on the right. So going to go ahead and stop the camera. Alright, so now we need to actually prepare the project. Now, if you are using the built-in project, make sure to import the shader graph Unity asset. This should automatically be included in Unity 6, but we can quickly check it by also going into our package manager and into the Unity register. So my package manager is down here anchored. However, if you need to get to it, you can just go to Window and then click Package Manager. Mine's down here. And the first thing we can do is click on the Unity register, and then in the search field at the top, type in shader. Now, if yours is grayed out here where it says remove, that is installed for you. But if it's not installed, go ahead and install it and make sure you've got it imported into your project. That's the first step to have set up. The next thing we need to do is actually import the asset into our project, right? There's two ways you can do this. The first way is just by going into My Assets and searching for the Better Fog system there. Or you can go to the web page and make sure that you're signed in. And when you're signed in, you can click this Open in Unity button, Open in Unity Editor, and you can see it takes you straight to the asset. Now, notice how I was saying before that it says import 1.3 into project, but if you hit releases, it does say 2.0 beneath that. I assume it's just because the developers just put in the wrong version there, so do just take note that mine says import 1.3 to project, but if you do just want to check, you can just hit releases really quickly and just see that it says 2.0 there. I'll be saying I'm using version 1.3 because that's the one that is being displayed. I won't be using this 2.0. Just take a note, if I say version 1.3, I am referring to this here. Okay, let's go ahead and import the asset into our project. And of course, if you don't see this at all, you just want to download the asset first, and then you want to import it into your project. So I'm just going to hit import, and here's everything that's going to be importing into our project. And we do want to import everything. Okay, now that the asset is in our project, let's go over to our project window. And now we want to double click on iNav Studios, and we want to go to post-processing, and then we want to click on Better Fog. You want to use whichever .unity package is relevant to your project. So if you're using built-in, you obviously use that. If you're using URP 2022, you'll use that. Those of us that are using URP 6 will be using Unity URP 6. Go ahead, double click that and import everything there. Okay, with that now imported into our project. So now that we have successfully upgraded our asset now as well to be able to be used with Unity 6, you'll notice that we've been getting some console warnings. Now, these warnings are totally fine. You can just go ahead and clear these. In my testing, they don't actually matter. And now what we need to do is actually set up the asset itself. So again, I'm using the URP. I need to follow the instructions from the documentation that are relevant to me, the URP setup. But if you're using the built-in, make sure you follow the instructions from the documentation for that. And don't worry, there's not much here for this. This is pretty straightforward. But if we look at the documentation, we can see here that it's got some stuff about the shader graph that we were just doing. It talks about the URP setup, and we're currently up to this URP part. Going to go down page that. What point is reading the documentation? That's what the video is here for. There's many different ways to get to your project settings and graphics. You can go up through your edit, and you can go to project settings here, and you can go to graphics, and that is one way to get into your project settings graphics tab. The other way is to go to your project window, and inside your root assets folder here, you can go into settings, and then this setting here at the end, the universal render pipeline global settings asset, the one with the gear icon. If we make that the focus of our inspector, you can see here that it says open project settings graphics. That's another way it can automatically take us to it. Now, what I'd like you to do is in your project window, just make sure that you've got it unlocked, because we're going to start using the reference fields to navigate us around the project. Here we have the default render pipeline, and there's a reference field next to it, the PCRP asset. Previously, before Unity 6, this was named the Universal Render Pipeline Data, and it has changed now. So what we want to do is click that, and it's referencing this file here. So we want to click that and go into our inspector. And under our inspector, we want to make sure that the depth texture is actually enabled. For me, it already is, but make sure that's enabled for you too. Next, we need to go into the PC renderer universal render data, which is that reference field above that depth texture. So just go ahead and click that, and you'll see that references us to the next file. We want to click that file, and now this is where we actually want to set up the asset. Go down to the bottom here and click add renderer feature. Then you'll see better fog. Click that. And now the better fog has been added to the project. Now, if you were to go and try and get the demo scene to work from here, it's not going to work. You actually need to do a couple more steps. You need to expand this category and then open up the settings subcategory. And then where it says after rendering transparent, you actually need to select before rendering post-processing. And you also need to have use custom depth textures and fog offset textures for the demo scene to work. And these two associate to two different things, and I'll explain them when we actually get into the demo scene. To find our way to the demo scene, let's just go back to the assets root file, and then we want to go into the INAB Studios, post-processing, better fog, and then we want to actually click on common URP. Then we want to click on demo scene. That is quite the root directory to follow. So what we can do here is just select the demo URP, Control C that, and then we'll go back to assets. And I'm just going to go into scene, and I'm just going to copy paste that demo URP there, so that way it's nice, quick, and accessible there. Okay, with that now, let's go ahead and open up the demo URP scene. And as you can see, we load straight into the scene, and we can see some fog, and we can also see some water here moving occasionally. And it's more prevalent when we actually move the camera around. And this is just because it's a rendering effect that's happening. So remember what I was talking about with the needing to enable those settings? Now, you don't need to do this, but I just want to showcase why your asset might actually not be working. If we go into settings and then go into that PC renderer where we added our better fog component to the renderer, if I disable use custom depth textures, you'll see that the water looks like it's now covered in fog. But if I re-enable it, it looks like the water now has its depth back. And that's a rendering effect to make this material appear to shine through the fog, so to speak. Then beneath that, we have the use fog offset texture. And if we click and enable and disable from this angle, it looks like that use fog offset texture is doing nothing. But if we go over here to this blue square or blue rectangle and we click the use fog offset texture, you can actually see that the fog in the distance there is rendering and not rendering. Now, I don't know why this is the first example that the developers used. It might be just to showcase the depth and also that use fog offset texture. But for us, we're going to start from top to bottom. So we're just going to go ahead and click that, and we're going to disable that example, and we're going to enable the vertical fog plane offset example. So let's enable that. Let's just position ourselves so we can actually see it in our scene camera. Looking at this, we have some cubes, and these are all empty. They're just used as reference points. We have a directional light. Without that, the scene would be dark. We have a vertical fog plane, which is empty, and we have a global volume, which has this better fog component attached to it. Okay, so this vertical fog plane then, if we move this up and down, we're moving the fog with this. Okay, cool. So what happens then if we try to copy this object? Just go with a Control C, Control V, and now that we've got our clone, we move it up and nothing happens. Okay, well, why might that be? You might think, well, maybe it has something to do with the material. And we can check that by going and expanding that, and you can see that there's actually no parameters here. Let's go ahead and check our camera here, and you can see that there's a better fog renderers script attached to it. If we expand this depth renderers, we can see there's one element there, and let's expand that, and there's the water mesh, so that's for our water from earlier. If we expand this fog offset, we've got element 0, which is for the window. That was from that first scene as well. Okay. Then we've got this particle system. Well, that's not what we're looking for. Particle system again, we're not looking for that. Particle system again, we're not looking for that. We want to be looking for the fog plane that we currently have in this scene. Okay, vertical fog plane, is that the one? Yes, it is. Okay, let's take a look at this then. Let's see how this is actually working. Well, it's got a renderer that is enabled, an always render, which is disabled. A renderer, which is the vertical fog plane's object mesh. It's got a draw all submeshes, which is disabled, and a material for a vertical fog plane offset. We haven't seen that material yet. So let's go and check that material out. What I suggest that you do is that you go to your hamburger icon on one of your anchored windows and click on add tab and add a project window. I've already got quite a few here, but for the sake of this tutorial, we're going to hold control and zoom in, and then this vertical fog offset, we want to click that, so that way it references us to this material. Now I want you to go ahead and lock that window, so that way we've always got this open here. If you do lose it, it's okay. You can just go to Assets, INAB Studio, Post-Processing Assets, Better Fog, common, and then to your materials, and everything will be there. Okay, now let's see if we can actually replicate the effect. So we've got our vertical fog plane here. So what we want to do is we want to click on this plus icon at the bottom of the array and press plus, and it's added the element 11. And what it does is it actually creates a clone of the previous entry before it. So let's just go grab now that vertical fog plane, click and drag, don't release your mouse button, click and drag it over to element 11 and then release. And now you can see that fog plane has moved up, and you can see that both these fog planes are actually working in this scene. Okay, so that fog offset then, let's just check that material out. If we click on that, we can see that there's a alpha, a distance, and a power. So there's some parameters here that we can use to adjust this fog effect on our material, but we can't actually change the color of this fog. But you see that the fog is the same color as the background. So what is the magic source behind this? Well, we have the global volume, and in that we have the better fog component. If we click this checkbox here, you can see now we've got some very basic fog effects happening in our scene. We've lost our background, and this is turned to a very creamy white color. But still, how does it have this color selected? So this is the thing about the better fog system. If we go back to our project settings and scroll down under the URP tab, you'll see that there's this better fog setting. And if we click this fog color here and change it, you can see that we're changing the fog color within our scene. You can consider the better fog project settings, which is this one here, as your project's default fog. If you don't have a global volume enabled, this asset is going to use this better fog default settings in your project settings. So just bear that in mind, that this is your redundancy. Now, for the sake of this tutorial, I won't be going into the settings here, but I'll be going into the settings in the global volume. And the reason that is because there's just more settings that I can edit in the global volume than there is in this default volume. Now, the keen eye among you, we're probably looking at this iNav Studio Better Fog volume. Now, for the Better Fog, the version 1.3, there is a typo and redundancy. The typo you can see is this space between iNav and Studio, and the redundancy is this Better Fog volume. I assume this will be fixed up in future versions, but towards the end of this asset, I will show you how to fix that up. Just bear in mind that if you do want to fix that the package manager, when you update, will remove your changes. Okay, so let's go back to our global volume over here. Let's enable the Better Fog volume. And there we have it. We're back to our normal fog. That's pretty straightforward. Let's go back to the camera and remove our array element 11 here. Let's right click on that and press delete array element. And let's disable this example. And let's move into the world fog plane example. Let's enable that. As soon as we get in, it doesn't look that impressive, but the magic is happening inside this channel here. So let's position our scene camera inside, and we can see this kind of fog effect. We've got some stairs here. If we expand the example, we can see that we've got a global volume, which is disabled. We have some cubes, which again are just being used to give some detail to the scene. We've got the directional light and a plane. With the plane, let's go over and look at the material here. If we expand that, we can see that we've got some surface inputs. And this corridor fog plane, if we right click that and press select material, you can see that it's also inside of our Better Fog Common Materials folder. And here's some settings that you can change for it. So you can obviously change the color and the distance, which makes it appear that it's coming from further back than where it actually is. So that's a really cool effect. I really like that. And then we have power, which is just to change the focal point, and it helps you fine tune where you want that effect to appear that it's coming from. Now it's worth noting that while the illusion is there, that's not baked in there, okay? So once we actually go through that plane, the effect's gone. Now if we do enable that global volume system, you can see the fog appears in the background and it just darkens the inside here. So that effect isn't affected by the global volume. Okay, let's disable that example now. Let's move into the next example, which is the world sphere analytical fog. Now this is pretty much the same as the last one, except for it's just a sphere. Again, if we expand the example, we can see we've got some cubes for references. We've got the directional light, and then we have this sphere. Again, we can also go to the material of that sphere and expand that. We've got some properties here. We can right click it. We can see that that material is yet again inside the Better Fog Common Materials folder. Probably worth noting as well that if you are going to change these settings, that you might want to back these up if you want the original reference point, because if you change these materials, it changes for everywhere. But anyways, I'm not going to bother creating a backup for these materials for this project because it's just a tutorial, but it's good practice to keep a backup of the originals. That way you've always got an original reference point to work with. Okay, looking at the material properties for this one this time, we have again a color, so we can change that to whatever we like. Again, the density, which changes how visible the effect is. Density effect, and this is just a multiplier to the above, just to help you fine tune. And then we have power, which changes the volume of the effect, making it either softer or appear harder, That's what she said. And then we have radius, which of course affects the fog's effect size, but as you go larger past the original object size, it won't increase the actual mesh size, it just makes it look like what the fog will look like. Okay, that's it for this example now, pretty basic and straightforward. Let's move into the height fog plus offset multiplication example. This is my favorite of the whole lot. If we position our scene camera over these objects, you can see that it appears that we've got some fog cutting effects here on these three objects. So just quickly, let's go through the scene. We have a directional light, we have some cubes which are being used as reference points. Then we have fog offsets with 3 spheres, and each of those has a child object named offset 1, 2, 3 respectively. And then we have a global volume in the scene as well. So if we click on our sphere and expand this material, you can see that this material is nothing special. It is just a basic material. If we click the offset and we look at the material here and the properties, again, there's nothing special. But if you remember from the vertical fog plane offset example, this fully transparent material was being used for the fog plane. So if you thought that would be going to the camera again to see this, you'd be right. Let's click on the camera and let's scroll down until we see offset 1, 2, and 3. So if I click these, you'll see that those reference those sphere offsets inside our hierarchy. So what if we want to create our own custom cutout for this fog? Well, I'm going to right click and I'm going to create a cube. And I'm just going to move this cube up so that way it is in a position that I can see it. And now I want to scale this cube up a bit. And I'm just going to move it down a little bit. Maybe it's a little bit big. Let's make it a little bit smaller. There we go. So the first thing we want to do is make this cube transparent. So we can drag that transparent material onto the cube. And now the cube is invisible. Let's click on the cube and you can see that there's this shadow effect happening still. So under the mesh renderer where it says cast shadows under the lighting subcategory, go ahead, click that and press off. Okay, now it looks like we have a completely invisible cube. Now the next thing we need to do is go to the camera, and in that better fog renderers script under the fog offset renderers, we want to add another array element. And as you can see, it's still cloned the above profile. We want to reference the cube in that renderer reference field. And because we've left it as the vertical fog offset, it looks like there's fog inside this cube now, which is pretty cool. But we're not after that effect. What we want is the sphere offset multiplication. So if we click that, we can see there's this green one here. So let's go ahead and click and drag that into our vertical fog offset, and you can see in the game camera here that we've got a clear cut through the fog. And if we move our scene camera, we can also see the same effect. You do need to be obviously looking through one of the planes for the effect to be fully taken place. And we can click that and we can drag that around and it looks like we're cutting through the fog. So like I was saying, you could use this in RTS. You could use this as your fog of war cut through. You're probably thinking, well, I can see the objects through the fog right now. You just disable those meshes for that object. Then you can say when these two fog cutters collide, you turn the mesh on so that you can see them entering into the fog. So if you're like me, you could definitely think that you could use this as a fog of war system, and you definitely can. You can make the fog appear to be thicker or darker. You can change it entirely, but we'll get into those settings at the end. So that's how we can do the fog cutting. Let's just go ahead and delete that cube and let's go back to our camera and remove that array element that we added for it. And we can go ahead and disable this example and move into the particle fog offsets, fog particles example. So as you load into this scene, you won't see any particles actually playing. And that's because we just got to hit the play mode. So that way we can see the particles actively playing. Now from this angle, the effects look pretty great. We've got a fire, we've got some dust, and then we have some fog. Now if I go back to the fire and I go in level with it, and as I move up, you can see that it looks like this fire is blending in with the fog in the background. And that's because the wall behind it is giving it a backdrop. So it makes it look like there's a bug with this particle effect system, but it's just because the backdrop. So if I was to, again, go in and create a 3D cube and use this cube as our backdrop, so I've expanded it up a bit so we can make it look like a bigger wall, and just drag that behind the fire, again, move that up, you can see that the fire effect is actually working fine. It's just because it needed a backdrop. Just going to delete that cube again. So we have our fire and dust storm, which are both just using the particle effect system, and they're using their own materials to give the particle effect the look that they're after. So let's see what this fog effect is doing. It's important that you add them to the better fog renderers list. So if we go to camera, and we can see inside of our fog offsets that we do have the ambers, the wildfire, and the dust storm being referenced. And we can see how they're working. If we go into the wildfire here and enable and disable that, you can see that there's this orange hue behind the fire with that disabled. It's more prominent when we again move our camera below so that way there's no backdrop behind the fire. So now if we disable the wildfire you can see that the difference between that render being on and off is night and day. I guess you could say that this system is quite lit. Yeah, look, I'll see myself out. I've got to have a couple of jokes in here, otherwise it'll be dry. Now, let's take a quick look at this other particle effect playing here. Now, you'll notice that this is the same blue color as the background. And if we go to our global volume here, and inside the volume better fog, if we click this fog color and change the color of the fog, you'll see that this is also changing with it. So what's the magic sauce here? Well, again, it's using the fully transparent material. So this particle is using the same fully transparent material as all the others, as everything else that's getting fog applied to it, right? So again, in the camera, if we go to the procedural fog here, you can see that there's a procedural smoke fog offset. Now, before you click that, that material is in a different folder. So again, click your hamburger icon on one of your anchor points, press add tab, and you want to click on project. Again, we'll scroll in, make sure it's unlocked, and we'll click procedural fog, and it will take us to the procedural fog materials folder. Just go ahead and lock that. Now we have access to this material that's been used as the offset. And you can see there's some different parameters in here that you can edit to change how the fog appears on that fog effect. So just quickly for this procedural smoke fog offset material, we have this first field here that says use as fog particle. If I click that and enable that, you can see that it actually switches the two different colors between the white and the red. Now in the documentation, it does mention what the red material is for, and we'll go through that towards the end, but we'll just leave that on for now. Then we have this color here. Now this doesn't really do anything because again, we have the global volume overriding this, and then we also have the default project settings overriding it as well. So this will just change the visibility of it more than anything. So just bear that in mind. We have the surface depth fade, which just changes how strong the fog is. We have the camera depth fade range, changes it from the camera perspective. We have the camera depth fade offset, which again changes the camera's perspective. We have noise timescale, which changes the noise map of the effect. That just changes how it looks. We have the noise scale, which is a multiplier to the above. The simple noise amount, which again is also a multiplier, and the simple remap, which again changes how that effect just plays out. Now there is just one thing I want to point out in the scene. I'm just going to change the global volume here to something a little bit more friendly on the eyes. If we go back to our camera object and then inside this fog offsets, these particle effects aren't using a mesh. I just want to point out though, that if you have an object for whatever reason that uses a mesh and a particle effect on the same object, you can't reference the particle effect directly into this array. So if I just lock my inspector and drag my other inspector window out to the side here and lock that one. So I have one version on the camera and I have the other version on the wildfire here and lock that. Here's this particle effect. Now if I click and drag that into the wildfire system here, you can see that it's saying it won't go. But if I click and drag the wildfire onto the array, you can see that it actually does accept that. But if you had a mesh on this object as well, so if I scroll down and press add a mesh renderer, this asset can be a little bit temperamental. If I click and drag this wildfire that has both the particle effect and mesh on it, reference that, you'll see that it favors picking up the particle effect system. Now, if that mesh renderer is at the top and I click and drag that wildfire over, you can see it favors to pick up the mesh. Now you might think, well, then it takes priority over whatever's inside the component list first. Yes and no. Sometimes it will favor the mesh entirely over the particle effect system, and sometimes you will be able to sort this out here. Maybe if you are using this just to try and separate your meshes from your particle effects, you can get it to work sometimes. And if you want to actually reference the mesh from the game object with the particle effect, you can just click and drag that over by itself. It will accept that. It just won't accept the particle system by itself. So again, we can just fix that up by click and dragging. Oh, there you go. See, it's not working now. What if we delete the wildfire and then try and reference that? There you go. It's favoring that mesh now from before. So we just remove that component and add the wildfire back in, and there we go. So it is a little bit temperamental, but I don't know when you would have a mesh and a particle effect on the same game object. You'd normally put the particle effect on as a different game object anyway. So might be fine. It may just be a couple of small cases where that might play up, but it's an easy fix. Okay, so with particle effects all done now, I do want to just point out that I don't want to dive into the particle effects system. That's out of the scope for this video. We don't need to know how particle effects work for the better fog system to work. But if you want a tutorial on the particle effects system, feel free to drop a comment and let me know whether that's something you'd like to see or not. So now with the particles fog offset plus fog particle example done, unlock my inspector window. So just go ahead and stop play. Let's now go ahead and disable the particle fog offset plus fog particles example. And let's load back into that first example that we loaded into the demo scene with. Now we can already go straight into this scene with pretty good knowledge that this window here, it's going to be using the same camera renderer as before the other example. But this window material here, if we expand that, right click and select material, you can see that inside our locked window, inside the better fog common materials, that we have that window material. And again, it's got two basic parameters. We've got an alpha, which changes how transparent the window actually is. And then we've got the actual color of the window. But if we want to change the fog effect, we need to go to the camera. And here we have the window mesh. And then we have that window fog offset. If we click that, we can see that it's this green material here. So this first field here, the fog offset, I don't really know what that's really applying to. But if we use the distance lerp, we can see that we have this really rigid cutout now of the fog. So it's like it's clearing the fog entirely, just as if you were using the fog cutout effect from before. We can change the distance of the fog, which we'll probably need to re-enable that lerp. And we can change that fog. We can change the fog offset near, and we can change the fog offset far as well. So that's all the examples now. With that now, you've got a pretty good foundation of how the demo scene works. The only thing that I've got left now to cover in terms of assets for the better fog system is the global volume fog settings. I'm going to go through every single setting here. That way I can give you just a really quick rundown of what everything does. And then you'll be fully prepped to be able to just jump into this demo scene and play around and see how everything works together. I do still recommend that you check out the documentation, because if we go into features and then scroll down towards the bottom, we'll see that we have this fog offset here. The fog offset renderer texture utilizes the red and green channels. Red adjusts fog offset, allowing you to either add or subtract from the fog volume. This is handy for custom fog particles and world fog offsets. Green handles fog multiplication. A value of 1 means the fog will no longer be present at the renderer's location. So that's the magic sauce behind the cutout effects and adjusting how the fog is actually being represented in the scene. The greens are changing essentially how visible the fog is, and the reds are giving you the ability to, as it says, add or subtract to the fog value. So it is definitely well worth reading through the documentation, even if you are watching this guide. I'm going to explain things from the perspective of how they work, whereas the documentation will be explaining how things work technically. With that out of the way, let's go back to my favorite example. So let's disable this one. Let's go back to the height fog plus fog offset multiplication. Okay, now inside this scene, let's just go over and center our scene camera, so that way we're overlooking the scene like we were earlier. And now let's go and expand that and let's close up everything else so we can just focus on the global volumes here. This game object has this volumes component attached to it. You can see here that there's a mode, a weight, a property, and then there's this where it says learn 3 volume profile. So this is a shared profile property. This is a shared volume profile reference field. Global is saying that this volume that we have active is affecting the global scene and not just a local area. So if we want to change it to a local effect, we can just click it and then press global. Now you can see that there is no fog at all in the scene. And you can see that the object is just sitting here. You can see here it says add a collider to this game object to set the bounds of this local volume. So we can just press fix and assign it a collider. I'm just going to add a box collider. And now this box collider is the bounds of the fog effect. So if I go in here, you can see now that it looks like the entire scene is covered with fog. Now if I move the camera out of here, you can see that there's no fog. So that's the difference between local and global. Local is affecting just one area, and global affects the entire scene. As you can see here, it's saying that it doesn't need a collider. So you can just press fix and it will remove that collider for you. Now we know how to set up a global and local volume component. Next, we can see that there's a weight. And again, that just changes how strong that fog effect actually is in the scene. Next, we have priority, which is there to help you sort them in terms of their priority. So if I had a volume that was 1, it would override everything that was 0. And then if I had a volume that was 2, it would override everything that was 0 and 2. So essentially, the higher the number, the higher its priority. I'll leave that on 0 though, because I don't have other volumes in the scene. So obviously then, now we have this shared volume profile reference field here. So if I go to my project window, make sure it's unlocked, and then press that, it will send me to these profiles. Now again, I just want to state that if you're playing around with this yourself, it's always worthwhile backing these up so that way you've got the original still somewhere in your project. This profile Learn 3 has a tone mapping, a bloom, a lifts gamma gain, and a better fogs effects enabled. And we can go through and we can turn these on and off, and we can also edit these other effects if we would like to. Now this isn't a guide based on volumes. This is a guide based on just the better fog side of things and getting you up to speed on that. So if you'd like to see a tutorial on volumes, again, feel free to drop a comment, let me know. So let's now just focus on this better fog effect setting. So you can see that there's quite a lot here to go through. Now, I don't know when the right time is to warn about these kind of things, but I do want to just put a disclaimer in that if you're sensitive to strobing or pulsing effects, when we get to the 3D noise section for this asset, there are some settings that can kind of cause strobing and these pulsing effects. So just a heads up. Okay, let's go through these settings and I'll try and go through these as quick as I can. So under main, we have our fog intensity. This is how thick the fog is. You can see in the background there. Then we have energy loss. This affects how much light can pierce through the fog. Next, we have use color gradients. So for the rest of these settings here, this first checkbox is to override the settings for this volume. So this is saying that if you have this enabled, it will be using whatever you have set here instead of the better fog project settings. So instead of using the default settings you have in your project. So for all of these, we have the override. This is essentially saying that if you have this enabled, it will be overriding your better fog project settings effects. So if you remember from our project settings, it'll be overriding what you've got set here. And then of course, if you have that disabled, it'll be using whatever is set here. So we want to override, and then we want to toggle whether we want this effect to be actually active or not. So this is whether we want the effect to be active for this global volume. So enable that. So what this actually does is it changes the fog to a gradient instead of just one whole color. Gradient start will change where the fog pattern starts, and gradient end will change where the fog pattern ends. But to actually see these effects take place, you will need to pick a fog texture. So if we click on the object picker icon here and we choose a fog gradient from the presets we already have with the asset, double click one of those, and now we change these settings, you can see that it does change as we manipulate these. I'm just going to go ahead and turn that off now. That obviously fog color is the color of the fog that we want. We've already played with that. Next we have sunlight. So again, we have an override. This is whether we want to be using the better fog project settings or the local settings here. We want to be overriding for this tutorial, and then we want to enable this sunlight effect. Now it's worth noting here that if you have an active light source in your scene using the directional type light, the better fog volume light won't be visible. So if we go to our directional light over here, we can change this from directional to spot or anything else, or we can just disable this game object. And now if we go back to our global volume here and we turn that sunlight on and off, you can see that we're getting this orange light in the background. And now the light is coming from over there. You can change the sun color, of course. You can change the sunlight intensity and the power of the sun. And again, you can use that directional light just as long as you change it from directional to spot or point or an area baked one. We go back to global volumes. I'm just going to turn that use sunlight off now. Now again, for distance fog, we want to make sure that we have the override enabled, so we use the local settings. Let's go ahead and enable this effect. Now, so that way we can see the effects as I play with them. I am just going to quickly turn the fog density up, and now I'm going to start from top to bottom. So to use radial fog distance, you can see that with that on and off, we're getting a slightly different fog effect in the background there. It's minute, but it does slightly alter the fog effect in the scene. So it's just one of those fine tuning options that you can go with. We also have a distance fog offset. So as we increase that, the fog becomes thicker. And as we decrease it, the fog doesn't seem to be as thick. We have exponential squared or exponential or linear. These will change the way that the effect is calculated. And if we go with linear, we have a scene start, which will change where it starts, and change end, which will change where it ends. So these are all just fine tuning of how you want distance fog to be set up. We go exponential, we can change the fog density just on the slider, and the same thing for the squared. It's just slightly different ways of being able to edit that distance fog setting. Just going to disable that effect now. Next, we have the Skybox height fog. Again, we have the override, so I'll be using that to use local settings. And obviously this is already enabled because if you see in the background, we have fog everywhere, but if we disable it, all of a sudden we have no fog. You can see we have this height here. If we turn that down, you can see that the height of the fog also goes down. And if we turn it right up, It's like it's going up into the sky as well. If we move the camera up out of it, you can see it's just like this flat level of fog. So if I disable the Skybox height fog, you can see now that there's no fog in the background or in the Skybox. So now if we turn the Skybox height fog off, we can see that there's no fog in the Skybox anymore. So let's enable that. Now just slide all these settings all the way over to the left. And now with the Skybox still on, it looks like it's not in the Skybox anymore. So now with all those sliders over to the left, so for this, it's better to start from the bottom than going up rather than from top to bottom. So Skybox fill, if we increase that, we can see that it's filling up the Skybox. Then we've got the fog intensity, which changes how strong the fog is in the Skybox that it's consumed. Then we've got the Skybox hardness, which is just used as a multiplier to the intensity of the fog. And it's almost like this is backwards. And then we have the Skybox fog offset, which you can see there's another multiplier to the below settings. So again, this is all just used to fine tune how you want the fog to be affecting the Skybox. So I'm just going to turn that off in the meantime, because now we're going to move into the height fog settings. Again, we want to make sure that the override's enabled, so that way we can use the local settings. The effect is enabled, and now we have the height. This is the height of the fog. So this is using world space now. So if I change this to 0, you can see that there's no fog on that level. If I change it to 1, you can see that there's now fog coming up to the world height of 1. Of course, if I change this to something like 5, all of a sudden, everything's getting engulfed. Change it to 10, you can see those buildings are fully encapsulated now. It is worth noting that those fog cutouts are still cutting through the fog, regardless of whether they're consumed in the fog or not. Next, we have the height density. So this changes just how strong the fog is in the scene. And then we can change the height fog type, again, using the different curves of how it applies to the world. I think the squared gives a better effect. So I'm just going to leave that enabled in the meantime. I'm going to leave the height at 10. Now let's move into the 3D noise effect. Now I just want to warn, this does cause strobing and pulsing effects, alright? So with 3D noise, we have the override enabled, so we're using the local settings. We want to make sure we enable the effect. Just hold my right mouse button down in the scene. You can see it looks like the fog is moving there. So let's just go ahead and press play here, so that way we can play with the settings and see them updating live. So you can affect whether you want to affect the height, distance, or both. So if we enable both, you can see that it looks like it's more aggressive now. You can change the noise intensity. So the higher, the more aggressive it moves, and the lower, it's pretty much still. Noise distance end changes where the effect ends. Noise end hardness, of course, changes how strong that effect is. Next we have scale. That will change how small the fog is. Now all of a sudden we've got fog waves coming through the scene. Then we have lerp, which changes that thickness of that fog. Then we have noise speed 1, and this is what we can use to change how fast that this fog is moving in those directions. And then we've got the time scale, where we can make it even faster again, scaling it up using this multiplier. And I don't know about you, but that is really cool, and that is really easy to use. Okay, I'm just going to go ahead and disable that effect now. Now finally, we have the screen space multiplier scattering. Again, we want to have the override enabled for use SSMS, and we have the effect enabled. When you move this, it's like it's changing the contrast of the fog. So if you move the slider lower, it gets brighter, and if you move the slider to the right, it gets darker. Then we've got this next setting, which is the soft knee, and this is just a multiplier to the above. Next we have the radius, and I don't know exactly what this is doing, but it looks like just another multiplier to the above. Now with blur weight, as far as I can tell, this effect seems to act as a modifier to the object not in focus, or more so the objects that aren't close. The higher the value, the more that they are covered by the fog. Then we have intensity, which again is the overall strength of this effect. High quality, I'm sure there's a use case for this, but in my testing, I haven't noticed it. And having it on or off didn't seem to change anything in the profiler. Anti-flicker, same thing again with high quality. We have an override and a choice of override settings being enabled or disabled. And in my testing, I haven't actually seen the difference, but I'm sure it's there for a specific use case. So if you do need it, you can come back here and enable it. And finally, we have the fade map, which is where we can use to change the overall effect of the fog. And we can even pass unrelated images into it to get some strange but cool effects. Oh, that's all good and all now. So let's actually see how we can use this better fog in a brand new scene. So I'm just going to go back to my assets directory in my project window, and then click on scenes and go back to my sample scene. Now I'm just going to create a basic setup. And there's my basic scenes. Let's now get the better fog global volume in the scenes. So I can create a empty object, and I'm just going to call it global volume. I'm just going to add the component to it. Volume component. I'm going to leave it as global, leave the weight as 1, leave the priority. And I'm going to click new profile. I'm going to add an override, and I'm going to add the iNav Studio with a space here and the better fog. Now I'm just going to speed up my little process here of creating a fog effect from scratch. It's easier to use one of the shared profiles, just create a copy of it and use that and just tweak what you'd like to see. But you can obviously do it from scratch, and that's what I'm just going to do here. It's not going to look as good, but I can show you it can be done. So just quickly demonstrate that you could use that fog cutout to use in a very dark place. So I just made it look like you could use that fog system, so that way you could use the fog cutout, fog that consumes the whole scene, and also just getting a very basic fog rolling in and out through here. And of course you can use the gradients to give that fog a bit more color, and you can also use the fade map as well. Okay, let's get into some code now. I'm just going to right click, create folder scripts. And in there, I'm just going to create a new monitor behavior script, and I'm just going to call it better fog manipulator. Just going to open that one up. So I'm just going to get rid of the boilerplate code here. So the documentation does state that you can interact basically with the better fog script that was attached to the camera. So to test this, we can reference a game object that we want to add to that renderer list. Let's say we wanted to maybe automate the process of adding all the different fog cutouts in our scene to our camera component. So if you wanted to reference a list of all your game objects in the scene, you could do a public list and you could do a for loop and add them all individually that way. In my case, I'm not going to do a loop here. I'm just going to do a basic version of adding a game object to our array of better fog offsets. So I'm just going to go with a public game object, test game object. Then I need a reference to the camera's better fog renderer class. So we can get that by doing a public better fog renderers. I'm going to call it my better fog renderer. And now we need to create a entry point for that. And you know, before we were adding those arrays, we're pretty much creating an element to go straight into that array. And we can do that by doing a public custom renderer. And again, I'm just going to call it my custom renderer. And now we need a method to actually call this from. So I'm just going to call it private void set custom renderer. Now the my custom renderer, now we want to add our information into the array element. So we go my custom renderer to reference that's to get access to that array element. And we do dot renderer. So we want to access the renderer component. And we can set the test game objects, get component mesh renderer component. So now that is going to automatically assign the test game objects mesh renderer to that. And we can do the same thing for the material. My custom renderer dot and equals. And now remember, we don't actually want to add the test game objects material here. We want to add a material of one of the effects that we wanted. So we want to use the fog offset. So here we should probably reference. So here we should also reference that material. So we can go public material and we can call it the better fog offset material. Let's grab that, copy it down here. And now what we need to do with that information is we need to actually enter that into the camera's script. So we go better fog renderers dot, and we want to access the fog offset renderers. So we dot add, and we add my custom renderer to that. Now, if you're doing this for the depth renderer, you do my better fog renderers dot depth renderers, add and renderers. So that's pretty straightforward, and you can call that on an event or whenever you press a button. You could even do this as a list that way for each object in the scene. Pretty handy to have a automatic system of doing that, because if you're doing that for hundreds of objects, that would get old very quickly. So that's good to have, great to know. Now I want to dive in just a little bit deeper. Now this is probably going in a little bit further than it needs to be. So yeah, I'm not a great coder, but I do enjoy coding. It's a fun pastime. So you know how before I emphasized about the global volume profiles and shared profiles? So this here is the volumes profile, and this reference field, the thing that it's referencing, is a shared profile. It's important to keep a distinction for when you're coding here, because those are two different things. So the volume has a profile, and then it is referencing the shared profile. So if we go back into our script here, so we can see what profile we have selected on a volume by doing something like this. So we'll use this test game object here from before, so we can now look for a public volume, call this the target volume component. And then we also want a components profile. So we do a public volume profile, and we'll just call this the target volume. And now we can make a method for this. So let's just do a private get volume profile, void get volume profile. So what we need to do is we need to set the volume variable first. So let's go test volume component is equal to test game object dot get component, and then we do a volume. I did change it from target to test volume component because that makes a little bit more sense. And now we can do the target volume profile. It's equal to the test volume component dot profile. So now if we were to run this, we would get the target profile from the volume component. So let's create an update function, and I'm just going to do a basic if input dot get key down code dot t for test, and I want to run this get volume profile. Save that, go back into my scene. I'm just going to manually refresh it. This is the global volume that I want to look at getting. I'm just going to go to my main camera. I'm just going to add that script to the camera. I'm only interested in the test game object for this, so I want to get the global into there. Test volume component. So with that in there, let's go ahead and just press play, and let's see if we fill these fields when I press T. Click on the game window, press T, and there we go. The target volume, if I double click that, you can see that that's the volume profile here. If I change that, it changes it in the scene. If I go back to that script, that global volume should be in the scenes sample. There's that global volume profile right there. Okay, now that we actually are getting the global volume, why don't we edit these values via code? Maybe we want an event to happen where it changes the fog ever so slightly. Well, for that, I'm just gonna go ahead and delete this get volume profile part. We could do a check to see if we're using a global volume, or we could even create a new volume. So if we wanted to create a new volume, we could do something like this. We could do a public void create new volume. Let's create a reference field for this new volume. We could do a public volume profile and call it the new volume profile. Now, the first thing we should probably do in this is check whether we already have a profile attached to that game object or not. So just copy this line here so that way we can set the volume component to the script. And now we want to do a if statement, and we want to check whether the test volume component's profile is null. We'll do null. And if it is, we want to create a new profile. So the new profile is going to, we'll just grab this. So the new volume profile is going to equal a scriptable object dot create instance volume profile. And that's how we can actually get this new profile. The only thing we need to change here is we don't actually want the test components profile. We want the shared profile. We want to see if the shared profile is empty or not. That's what we're interested in. So if the shared profile is equal to null, we want to create a new profile. So let's go back into our scene. Let's go back to our main camera. And if I press play, in the test window, I press T, there was already a profile found, which is true. If we go to the global volume, obviously there's already a profile here. Now, if I press delete on that, go back to the main camera and remove that reference there. And I press T, creating a new profile. You can see that new profile is here. If I go to the global volume, you can see that hasn't been attached. It's only created the instance of that volume. So we actually need to reference that new volume for that script. So if we go back into our class over here, we want to make sure that we now assign this new volume profile. So we can go the target volume profile. So we can now go to the test volume component. We've got the test volume component's profile equal that new volume profile. Let's go ahead and see if that works. It's going to go to the global volume here and delete the referenced volume there. I'm going to go to the main camera and press play. Now let's press T, creating a new profile. And if we go to the global volume, we can see it actually hasn't set. And that's because we need to use the shared profile. Let's go back. Let's change this from profile, shared profile. Make sure that's empty. Let's press play. Going to press T. And you can see that we have this new volume profile, but its contents are entirely empty. And that's the problem with creating a new profile. You'll actually need to edit each variable manually, which we can do if we want. So we can say now that since we've created that new profile, we can edit some of its values. So remember here as well that the mode, weight, and property are a part of the component. So if we want to edit those, we need to go to this test component here, and we can go, since this is part of the component down here, we can go Control V there, dot is global, and we can set this to a variable or manually enter it. So we can do false or true. We can also do the dot weight. Again, we can set this by a variable or set it locally here. Priority. Again, we can set that to a variable if we like. We'll actually type to priority, set that to whatever we like, and change that by a variable as well. So now obviously we're going to intend to add a better fog effect to our volume. So if we want to reference this new better fog component, what we can do is we just do a public better fog volume component, new better fog component, copy that, and we can say new better fog component is equal to our new volume profile dot add, and we want to add the better fog volume component. It's this one here, and then we need to say true to override. We can override over here, and now we have that better fog component. We can now just start straight up editing the better fog. Control C, Control V, and we can go dot, and as you see, all the settings are in here. So we could go better fog color dot value, and then go equal color dot red, and refresh. Our new volume that we make, if I press T, you can see that the fog color is red. Okay, but what if you wanted to edit an already existing fog component? Now, one way to be able to get the better fog effect from our volume over here it's just going in and grabbing our test volume component, and we want to get the shared profile. We want to do a try get. We're trying to get the better fog volume component, and we want a local variable, which is the better fog volume component, and close that off. Now we want to set the better fog component to equal that. And now we can do the new better fog component is equal to that. And we can test if that works now by going into the new better, realize that's better fog component. Let's just rename that to better fog component. New better fog component, and now go dot underscore fog color dot value equals color, and let's do green. So if it doesn't find a profile, let's set the fog to red, and it'll be a new profile. And if it does find a profile, and the existing profile will be set to color green. Let's try that when we press T. So in our scene now, if I just make the global volume the focus of the inspector, if I press play, no profile found. If I just press T, we can see that that new profile is given the fog color red. And if I press T again, you can see there was a profile already found. And highlighting over the inspector will fix the color. It doesn't update immediately. You do need to refresh it. Also just switch between game objects, and you can see now it does change to green. So that's how you can create a new profile using script. You can change the new profile or existing profile using script, and you can also add to that camera's renderer as well using the better fog materials and renderers. So that's pretty much everything to do with the custom scripting side of things, but there is one thing I'd like to show now for the current version, and that's fixing up this iNAB Studio double up in the project's settings. So under the better fog, we have the better fog volume under iNAB Studios with no space, and the iNAB Studio 2 spaces. This is redundant. Now there's two ways you can fix this. One is fix the spelling and have them all under one title. This should work fine and not break anything, but the redundant better fog volume will still be there. And two is to remove it entirely. I just want to emphasize, I haven't had any problems with either of these approaches, but please back up your project and please test this before implementing this in your final releases or whatever you're building, because I don't know how temperamental this is. I haven't done any build tests, so I don't actually know, but this is the way you can remove that. So option one, let's go into assets, go to project, go to assets, go to iNAB Studios, post-processing, better fog, core URP 6, and then scripts, and we're looking for the better fog volume. It's this one here, the better fog volume. Double click that. Now we want to go to line 43, which is this line here, or you can control F and search for iNAB Studios. You can just simply go in between the iNAB and Studio and just enter a space between them, and then go back to the project and control R that to refresh. And now you can see that the better fog and the better fog volume are both under the same iNAB Studio title. Now, option two, going a step further and removing that better fog volume, what we can do there is, instead of renaming this file, we're just going to go ahead and get everything from under the namespace. So from line 9 all the way down to line 120 to that second last curly brace. And I'm just going to hold Control Shift and / to comment everything out, or you can delete it. I'm just going to comment it out. Now your IntelliSense should pick up that there is a problem in the project. That's because we do actually need to comment out another script, and that is going to be inside the editor. So to get to that, we can go into this editor here, which is in the same directory. Go to editor, better fog volume component editor. Just double click on that. Now the same thing from below namespace under the custom editor, we're going to select everything right up to that second last curly brace. Again, Control Shift / just to comment everything out there. Again, you can delete everything there if you like. I'll go back into my editor, Control R to refresh it. You can now see I've just got the one better fog left. And that just about covers everything for this asset. That is a really big asset to cover. That took many hours of writing and recording. I had to do multiple takes because there's a couple of little things I had to fix up here and there. So I wanted to give my review on this asset. Now look, I think the asset's great. In terms of the way that the asset store ranks things, it's a 5 out of 5. It does what it says it does. It took me a long time to put everything together into this video and make it into a tutorial. I spent probably about 5 hours playing with the asset, getting to learn how all the different things interact and fixing up little errors and worrying about, does this console error mean this or that? My opinion outside of those, do I think this asset is bad at all? It is quite a complex asset. Is it beginner friendly? No, it's not. It's not beginner friendly. If you're using the guide and using this video, yes, it is beginner friendly, but that's like everything. Everything's beginner friendly when you're using a guide, especially if someone can break it down simply. And I hope I did. But if you were a new user trying to pick this up by yourself and trying to use it, it's going to be a head scratcher because there's a lot going on and there's a few things you need to look at. So in terms for a new user, I'd probably give it a maybe 3.5, 4 out of 5, because the asset, when it does work, is fantastic and there's a lot you can do with it. It's a very powerful tool. In terms of performance, I didn't really get to test it that much. I don't really have an active project where I need something like this, that big scale, to really test this. But from my testing so far using the profile of different settings, it's fine. It didn't seem like there was really massive performance hits. I'm sure if you've got multiple effects going on, just like anything, it will affect it. But from a basic point, yeah, no, it seems fine. There is some errors with the project, like the naming convention of 2 INAB studios and the redundant better fog volume. At least I think it's redundant and it's not blatantly clear whether it is or not. My personal score, I have to maybe give this one a 4. And lately I've reached out to the developer to see how much code I can actually expose with this asset. And it's been now, I think, 2 weeks and he's still not gotten back to me. I've messaged them on Discord and they've still not reached out to me. And it is a common complaint that people have with the developer, that the support is lacking. Now, I don't want to bash the developer. They did say that they were on vacation at first and now that they've got some health problems. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. That's here nor there. I like to assume that everyone is telling the truth until proven otherwise. So at the time of writing for this video, maybe just give them a break. Maybe there is some health problems going on. Keep that in mind, you know, be kind, be respectful. I know I go through phases where there's some days where I just don't want to deal with anything at all. And those episodes can go on for weeks. You know, this depression, it happens. You know, cut them some slack. Their tools are relatively self-efficient. I haven't had any project breaking bugs with these assets. Yes, it's been complicated. Yes, it's been a process to get it working, but I think us as a community should be able to work together to get these things with some tutorials and stuff like that, and hence where I am. And I feel like I'm going to try and slide into this niche and get these assets up and running. The asking price for this asset, I think, is $30. I just quickly check. Yeah, it's $30. That's about $45 in kangaroo coins for me. So it is on the pricier side again for my currency. I don't really need much of a fog effect. In my games, I don't really care about fog. It's just one of those extra effects that I've always gone, oh, that's, you know, a later issue. And I never in my projects ever get to that finalizing step. I'm always moving on to the next thing, right? But if I need a fog effect and I again knew what this asset does, I mean, absolutely, it does do what it shows it does and more. Again, like there's a lot that you can do with this asset outside of just fog, right? Like I was showing with the quick assembly of using the fog with a really dark background. So I think the asset is definitely worth it. If you see it on sale, 100% pick it up. Yeah, I just want to reiterate, maybe just give the developer a couple of weeks. Maybe they're going through something, just give them a break. The asset, again, straightforward. The asset with the guide's pretty straightforward. Definitely have a read of the documentation. You just saw me using a URP 6 project. It definitely does work. So hopefully the negative comment there does see that it is working for Unity 6. And I think that's another thing I want to point out too, like using the review section to troubleshoot. That's kind of bad practice, guys. Like, you should probably not do that. There is channels to go through. If you do ask for help and then you don't get help in the appropriate channels, then absolutely review saying, hey, like, you know, I contacted a developer about this problem and it doesn't work. And I mean, look, I feel like the Unity store's long gone for that kind of level-headed reviewing process. So it's going to be up to external factors to try and create a ranking system. And I hope where I can build an audience to be able to be a trusted source of, yes, this works, no, this doesn't work, this needs to be improved, this doesn't need to improve. Hopefully get some proper voice out there about these assets, because again, with the dynamic voxelizer, people have reached out and said, you know, hey, look, you know, this is great, thank you for showing us that this works, and I'm happy to do that, because that's what these assets are for. At the end of the day, they're for developers like yourself and I to be able to speed up our projects. And the development process already is a blockade. We don't want these assets impeding further, right? Anyways, I'm harping on long enough about this. Long story short, is the asset worth it? Yes, pick it up on sale. It's definitely good. From my perspective, it's a 4 out of 5 in terms of a good asset. I'm only deducting 1 point there because the documentation doesn't state about the global volume component, and I've gone out my way to have to edit their editor scripts to get it to not double up things inside my project settings. And there's also a couple of console warnings and errors that pop up, particularly with the error that comes up at the end there where it talks about the list or element array of 0. And I'm not sure what that's related to. I need to test further, but yeah, I just thought it was worth mentioning. Hopefully you find this tutorial helps. Please like it, comment, and subscribe to help me grow the channel. Also, I want to announce that I am starting a Discord channel, so that way I can help support people and have other like-minded people support others as well. I want to try and build a community of people working together rather than just people coming in and taking what they need and buggering off or making negative remarks, because I understand that Discord support channels inside the developer channel is, you know, about complaints as well. I do want to just make a space where it is not so negatively geared, where it is more about support. That is currently being made. I want to get a bit of a bigger audience, that way we can get this Discord up off the ground. Anyways, that's it from me. Hopefully you found this helpful, and till next time, see ya.